this is not architecture. This is an obscenity. This is absurd. Architecture, there's nothing new. There's no place for humor in architecture and all the usual crap. All my colleagues, everybody was trying to get out of art galleries. Nobody wanted to do objects anymore. We worked in the streets or the landscape or performance art. It was a period of real revolution. But how can you like Mies van der Rohe and do what you do? And I said, why should I do what Mies van der Rohe did so well? I want to do what I do. You walk up to a work of art you've never seen before, and it doesn't change your mind about something. There's either something wrong with you or something wrong with the work of art. That's the whole point, is to put art where you least expect to find it. He called me before I called him. He said, James, I just read this. And I thought, oh my God, this is the end. He said, I love it. It's perfect. Let's do another building.
James Vines is a New York architect and environmental artist. He has been on a mission of sorts. James believes that architecture needs to be liberated from itself. It is this very act of liberation which is exemplified in at least 150 buildings he designed all around the world. Some were built in 11 countries. I believe the essence of the architect's most radical projects is expressed most acutely and successfully in a series of his showrooms he designed for Best Products Company. And it is going to be the focus of my conversation with James following this introduction. These projects were built, 9 stores all around America from 1972 to 1984. Unfortunately, most of them were since demolished. In fact, only one remains. It is called Forest Building in Richmond, Virginia. It was converted into a church, and it was changed quite drastically. Nevertheless, these projects are ingrained in our collective memory in a way. These projects were among the most frequently published architectural works, and they are remarkable works of art that provoke conversations, ambiguity, questioning, amusement, and sometimes even protest. The architect's most fundamental contribution is in his idea of placing art where people least expect to find it. He freed up architecture from all kinds of dogmas. His buildings are process-oriented, open-ended. They engage with nature, with landscape, and most of all, they are a lot of fun to visit. James is a great provocateur. He brought a rebellious attitude into the profession. And I would say that most importantly, he treats architecture as a form of critique, and he turned architecture in a way into a platform for continuous discourse. After this video, you can find a few links to some of my previous conversations with James and some articles. And there is his talk he gave at the Center for Architecture in September 2022, where I had the privilege to introduce him. Please enjoy this video and let me know what you think. Thank you.
How are you? Good morning.
Very good. Good morning. I can see you.
I
Hear you very well. So I want to discuss this buildings. As I mentioned, there are 9. They were designed and built for Best Products Company from 1972 to 1984 in Virginia, Texas, Maryland, California, Florida, and Wisconsin.
Yeah.
How did this project come about? Were you contacted by Sidney Lewis the founder of the best company directly? How did it happen?
Well, I started my career as a sculptor, and I had a quite successful, interesting enough, career doing independent sculptures and public art. And the Lewis family, I mean, Sidney and Francis, had started collecting my sculpture. And they also knew that I was doing like public art. And they had this industry, big box stores. And the problem was that they were being criticized in newspapers and things as having this great art collection, which was, primarily pop art and historic furniture. Extraordinary collection. If you haven't seen it, it's worth going to the Virginia Museum because it really is amazing. Anyway, so they started collecting my work, and Sidney knew I was doing some kind of public work, so he said, "Well, make a sculpture for one of my buildings or something." Well, at that time, in the meantime, I had already had this kind of change of heart and was beginning to get tired of doing sculpture. Because, again, when you're doing kind of independent works, kind of a neo-constructivist tradition, I just got tired of shape making and form making and all the stuff that's all the stuff that architecture still does. And then Kiesler, Frederick Kiesler, the famous Austrian architect, befriended me the last 4 years of his life and became a real mentor, and liked my work because it was architectonic, involved, combining steel and concrete, and they had a very architectonic feel. And so he liked that. But he finally just one day he said to me, he said, "James, abstract art is very old fashioned, and it's been around 100 years. And are you sure you want to be a modernist or a constructivist? Because you've already been preceded by so many good people." And I had already been thinking the same thing. I had just been going through a period of, like every artist has to go through. I think it was Duchamp who wisely said, if you want to be creative in your life, you have to clean off your desk at least 3 times. So I was in a desk cleaning mode. And so I started getting more and more interested in sort of environmental art. So that was also the period in SoHo, and all my colleagues, everybody was trying to get out of art galleries. Nobody wanted to do objects anymore. We worked in the streets or the landscape or performance art. It was a period of real revolution. And everybody lived in SoHo in these cheap rents, these incredible spaces for very low price. So, I had daily access to amazing colleagues, Gordon Matta-Clark, Bob Smithson, Nancy Holt, Mary Miss, Alice Aycock, Dennis Oppenheim. These were all people you would talk to at lunch. So we were all interested in various aspects of escaping the art gallery and getting into the work. And I've been fascinated with architecture, so I sort of said, well, let's start an environmental art organization. And we had already started SITE, but Sidney and Francis, they didn't know what we were doing. This was, late 60s, early 70s. And they hadn't heard about it. I hadn't announced it. So by the time they started discussing their buildings, I said, well, let's do something with the building. I said, let's do it in a more integrative way. And they loved it. And of course, I lived there a long time, and I did as well. So we shared that experience. I said, well, let's face it, and the way I explained it, I think it was very simple. I said that, in Italy, buildings speak to you. They're rich in iconography. And so architects and artists at that time had a huge advantage in terms of integrative arts. They could do it because there was a consensus among all the people when they used civic imagery or religious imagery. Everybody knew what it meant. To transport to the commercial strip of America was really a challenge. And I began to think that if nothing else, there's another kind of content. There must be something else that architecture or the public domain can do.
But did you have a specific in the very beginning a specific proposal?
They had one really ugly building in Richmond, and they asked us to renovate that building. It was, you know, and in terms of, you know, today's mandates really and obligations, adaptive reuse is very important. So we really started with adaptive reuse, and that produced appealing building. But to go back to this dialogue, it did start with that. You know, and so we did a bunch of sketches and drawings and different opportunities and different ways we could interpret it. And so the first one was the appealing building. And that got a lot of press and attention because I think it was probably the first time that people had used architecture as a kind of a critique of itself, or in a humorous way. And so, of course, the AIA and all the architects were outraged. This isn't architecture. There's nothing to do. There's no place for humor in architecture and all the usual crap that prevailed for the rest of my life. But it did cause a controversy. And then the Lewises, you know, big art collectors, they liked that kind of thing. So they said, well, we have a new building to be built in Houston. That was in the early 70s. And so that was the Indeterminate Façade, and that was built from, we used their archetype. So the idea was to use their archetype, which everybody recognized and everybody associated with. You didn't have to explain it. And you would transform or use the building in a sense as a critique of itself. So to have the opening, we had a huge black shroud made to put over the whole building, and then we lifted it off with helicopters. So it was a really dramatic opening, you know, the helicopters lifting off this shroud, and then reveal the building. And of course, it became world news the day we opened it. I mean, I would say it was the most publicized building at that time in the world, but that's for sure.
I even read on Wikipedia somewhere, I don't know if it's true, that it's the most quoted building, or the most, it had the most of the appearances in architecture.
For about 10 years, somebody did a survey or something, found out it was the most published building in the world for about 10 or 12 years. And it still is. I mean, it's still being used. I get requests every day from somewhere that somebody wants to use it for some reason or another. So it did take off, and it was controversial, of course, in the extreme. And there were articles in architecture magazines, especially in the USA. USA was a complete wall of resistance. So all of the advocacy and support we had was coming mainly from Europe. And Sydney and Francis liked that because they loved going to Europe all the time, and they loved the approval, and they became sort of celebrity patrons of the arts as through this thing too. So obviously that was, I remember that there was an article in Architectural Record after the building opened, and they had to review it because it was real news. And yeah, so it was a very indifferent review. Well, this is you know, this kind of thing, you know, not real architecture, you know, the usual such crap. But the next issue of the Architectural Record had all these outrage letters from architects, and I use them in lectures a lot. You know, this is not architecture. This is an obscenity. This is absurd. This is, and you know, they said it was, you know, encouraging destruction in our society, you know, and they gave it sociological meaning. Well, anyway, and a lot of the readers had written to cancel my subscription. So this was sort of the beginning of SITE's career. So when this magazine came out, I knew that Sidney Lewis was going to get it. This was Architectural Record, of course. And he called me before I called him. He said, James, I just read this. And I thought, oh my God, this is the end. He said, I love it. It's perfect. Let's do another building. And the public actually liked them because they kind of, because of the humor and because of there was kind of a self-critique. And I always compared them to great performers like Elvis Presley and there are others who kind of did self-mockery. It's sort of a self-put down. So I think people love the fact that this was a company that was self-effacing, like Liberace. Liberace was always making fun of himself. At the same time, he was an amazing performer. And Presley did the same thing. So I think people understood that. Whereas, the shopping center world and the architecture world didn't have the remotest clue. In Italy, my biggest advocate was Bruno Zevi, who was a real classic modernist scholar. So I was very surprised when he liked it. And he said, yeah, the reason I like it, it's not slavishly Eurocentric like all the American architects. All comes from modernism, constructivism, so slavish, and yours is somehow truly American. It has a truly American feel to it. And so he was very encouraging. And Bruno Zevi published the first book on SITE in Italy. Was the kind of authored the beginning, I think the introduction. And then, as I said, the rest is history, because as we did more buildings, a greater understanding of them, especially abroad, took place. And actually, this recognition abroad is very funny because, as you know, we've been working with Columbia on the archives for Avery Library, and we discovered I think there are 24 books, museum catalogs, whatever, on SITE. Only 2 of them are published in the USA. All the rest are foreign publications, which is kind of interesting in itself. So, as I say, it's hard to be a hero in your own country.
Yes. Just to go back to Bruno Zevi, why do you think he said that it's so American?
Well, because I think it was brash, and it also worked with a junk world. It was a junk culture situation. And I remember because Gordon Matterclark lived right next door, we were both operating on buildings. And one day he asked me, why do you do your work in that awful, non-art context? I said, that's the whole point, is to put art where you least expect to find it. And then, he sort of started thinking, and then I said, well, why do you just operate on those buildings that are going to be torn down anyway? And, I thought about it. I said, oh my God, his genius is to take something that's going to disappear, operate on it, actually cut it up and everything, and then it has to be preserved. So it's sort of preservation by demolition, which is brilliant. So we had a lot of respect for each other because we were doing things. And I was trying to help him. I knew the people who were the owners of Controlled Demolition. And so it's a famous letter. It's in most of the books on him, that at my recommendation, he wrote to the president of Controlled Demolition. And I guess they thought it was some kind of nutcase or something, sending this letter asking for their help. But no, it's a very rich history. I mean, I'm dumbfounded that, MoMA, I've been asking you for like last 15 years to do a definitive environmental art movement show where you recognize the whole context, not just the individual people, but the whole philosophy and all the stories. And so far they haven't done it, I guess, because they didn't think of it. But it's some museum is going to do it. I mean, there's got to be some bright curator out there who realizes this is a very important move because let's face it, architects are tremendously influenced by the environmental art. Everything we did from 1968 to 1975 had a huge influence on architecture right now.
Did you have a specific brief for each of these buildings? Or was
No,
it entirely from up to you?
no, it wasn't a brief. It was, I think the amazing part of the Lewises was the fact that they understood to get the best work out of an artist, you don't tell them how to do, and you don't tell them how to do it. And they were a little surprised that this building was done the way it was. Everybody was, of course. And it was so obviously making fun of their whole business in a way. And yeah, but they accepted it and they realized it. And as I say, as collectors of pop art was a send up of serious art in a way. And you know, Roy, they have collected Rauschenberg and Roy Lichtenstein. I mean, they really, and they had some great examples of their work, so that they understood that even pop art had already, and certainly Duchamp, for example, questioned the whole meaning of art. So this idea of questioning architecture and questioning stability and permanence and you know, all of these things, and then not being totally derived from modernism, I think it appealed to them. I think they understood it inherently, and they just said we want to do one in that community or this community or whatever. You know, as I was going to tell you before, one of the very funny incident, it wasn't funny at the time, but they had this public relations person, and after we'd done about 3 or 4 buildings, you know, the communities heard that Macbeth was going to have a store in their community. Oh, are we going to get a special? They called them the special buildings. Are we going to get a special building? And someone in the public relations department told these people out of Cincinnati or something, oh no, we only do those in important cities. Oh my God, it was a kind of catastrophe, you know, public relations. So, but they did try, I think they did try to put them in places where people would see them. I mean, they would get some impact.
So does this mean that you never, for these 9 buildings, you never had to present more than one scheme?
Sometimes we would have 3 or 4 ideas, approaches.
But they came from you, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, from SITE. I mean, you know, we sat down at meetings and shared ideas and things, but basically, you know, in the end, I sketched them up and I, you know, perused how it was going to be done and everything. Yeah, the biggest issue was how was it going to be done? You know, sometimes it looks simple, but it's kind of like a Miesian problem, because the simpler it looks, the more difficult it is to control it, you know. And so that was the problem, you know, how to do these things. Hanging bricks in midair, for example, and the inside-outside building, getting all those real objects going through the thermal wall. I mean, there were a lot of really technical issues that we dealt with.
And I understand that there were some versions, some ideas that were not built, right? Do you remember how many?
Well, yeah, the one I regret was rolling the parking lot over the building. I think that was for Dallas.
And why wasn't it built?
Well, that was going to be just too expensive to do, because I wanted the whole parking lot to ripple, and then you had to crawl over the building and support that system and pave the roof, and there was just a lot of technology involved there doing it.
So did you have to redesign it, or someone else designed it?
You know, we did 2 or 3 models. You know, I mean, you've seen the pictures of the model. So we knew exactly what we wanted to do, but it had to look casual. It couldn't look like contrived, you know, like all these, everybody's making undulations nowadays. I mean, you know, whole careers are being made with undulations, but they're all kind of geometric. They're all sort of static looking. And this one we wanted completely arbitrary looking, because if it wasn't completely arbitrary, it wouldn't have the right feel. So to do arbitrary curves and undulations like that, and that was pre-computer too, so we had to work it all out without the help of digital or CAD.
I like your quote. You said each of these architectural concepts treated the standard big box prototype as the subject matter for an art statement by means of inversion, fragmentation, displacement, distortions of scale, and invasions of nature. These merchandising structures have been used as a means of commentary on the shopping center strip.
Well, I mean, yeah, that kind of was the point. We were trying to find content in areas that were more social, psychological, environmental. In other words, as I said in the beginning of our dialogue, in Italy, you had consensus imagery to work with. In, what is it? Jung said, we're in the age of the collective unconscious. And so there are things that people subconsciously agree with, obviously, or all understand it the same way. So that was what we were always trying to find, is that what about these absolutely banal buildings was in people's subconscious? How did, they just went there to buy household goods or whatever and go home. They never ever were expected to find art there or any kind of anything other than a place to purchase merchandise. So we were always trying to find what would be people's expectations for this kind of situation, and then try to invert or play with that, what we figured they were thinking already. And in fact, I in that little MoMA video they just did recently, I said in that one too that the highest compliment that I received was an elderly lady saying to me one day, I never thought about a building before. And I said that, well, you got the point. You understood it perfectly, which is absolutely much deeper understanding than we're getting from the AIA, that's for sure. So I think that was the point, is to find ideas or thoughts that are simple, that trigger off other thoughts. Like what it makes you think about. I always used to say, and Vito Conci said the same, this is so much what it is physically. Obviously, there's the physical characteristics, but it's more important what it makes you think about. And Rauschenberg said it perfectly, is that, if you walk up to a work of art you've never seen before, and it doesn't change your mind about something, there's either something wrong with you or something wrong with the work of art. And that's so true. That I really believe. Your obligation as an artist is to be evocative or provocative or informational, or you have to change people's minds. You can't just be a confirmation. Everybody goes up to a building now and expects it to have some kind of neo-constructivist wiggles. And now you have a computer, you can make it really wiggly. Well, that doesn't change what Saradin and did 50 years ago, 60 years ago. I mean, just look at the curved and undulating buildings from the Sydney Opera House onward. It's obviously whoever did it the first time always does it the best. I mean, Le Corbusier was the genius who realized that we didn't have traditional iconography on buildings anymore. So what's going to be the art? Well, his idea that the art is the whole building, is the sculpture. And that is a revolutionary idea, and he did it better than anyone. I would say, in the terms of a building as a sculpture, as a absolutely brilliant piece of sculpture, the Ronchamp is the masterpiece of the world. No one has gotten anywhere near that, in my estimation, because just the way he did it, and the number of innovations and thought process of making a building into an amazing piece of sculpture. I mean, with all kinds of evocative and provocative, and he just did it. He had that touch.
I think you mentioned it somewhere, and just before this, you were describing in detail the structure that went into the Tilt building. So would you say the Tilt building is your favorite out of 9? And did you have any different options for doing it?
Well, at that time, when you think of an idea that you like, you just do it. And I think that was one of them. I really wanted to play with this whole idea of equilibrium and I think it's a well-known story. On opening day, people were really confused, and some woman figured out that I was the architect and were rushing over to me and said, "How do you expect me to get up to that door?" And from a distance, she thought she had to climb a ladder to get in the building. So it was I like it because it was done in a very minimal way. It's had a lot of influence, but I would say the two most influential buildings are cutting the notch in the corner entries have been done like hundreds of times since then, and lots of tilt buildings. I mean, I had this stuff in my files because one of the curators was doing work with me. God, he said, this like High-Rise of Homes and Tilt building and the Notch building. There's a lot of imitators of those. I said, yeah, there are. Somebody could do a whole exhibition on that alone, because there are a lot. There are, and people send me all the time, oh, here's something just like your building. And it's usually not. It's usually kind of misunderstands it, but they use the form. They use the gesture. Well, that's the fragmentation. When we first did the Houston building, fragmentation was forbidden. Everybody's, oh, it looks like a ruin. I said, it's not a ruin at all. It's about process. When you build a building and you take away a building, that interval is more interesting than the finished building. And so we're playing with that idea. But everybody, all these kind of official architects suddenly started liking fragmented edges. So James Sterling did the fragmented edges, and Izosaki did fragmented edges. So they all started doing it, but they did it in this kind of if you please way, make it nice and make it sweet. And in a sense, give it no impact. It just becomes part of formalist design again, the same old thing.
But as far as the Tilt building, could you talk about the need for buildings to communicate messages and why you think modernist buildings stop this important function of architecture?
Well, I don't think it started that way. I think that if you go back to the early Bauhaus and Mies, whose work I love, of course, they were trying to find a language that suited a new world. Simple as that. I mean, in the late 1800s, technology, building technology, certainly construction materials, technology, everything, were the future. Those were the raw materials and the sensibility of the future. So the modernists, had exactly the same kind of motivations I had. Why do you want to keep doing the same old thing? Why do one more Beaux-Arts hot decor kind of building? And so the integrity of it and the power of it in the beginning was obviously thinking of it, and then the power of that communication. It did communicate. It obviously became very successful. It became successful because it could be built economically, of course, which helped. But without Mies's sensibility, not the same. I mean, Upper 6th Avenue in New York has more awful buildings than almost any place in the world. Terrible misconceptions of what Mies was about, proportion-wise, concept-wise, everything. And not only do they not communicate, they offend. In fact, there's a book I quote in my lectures now from Canada on that whole psychology of public space, and the fact that a group in Canada has now studied this and feels that it causes depression, it causes people to feel they have no identity, that, all that kind of thing. So I would say the motivation was, like all changes, is you just get tired of the same old thing. When I left sculpture, I just finally one day I woke up, I said, I can't think of any reason to do shapes, just shapes for shape's sakes. And I do wonder, so many architects now, there's this gee whiz computer look, and it's just not art. It's just fancy shapes for the shape making sake. They don't have any other meaning. And I guess it's ending now, because I haven't seen one young person, at least written to me, and I guess of course, when they write to me, they already have some agreement, but I haven't seen any of them doing anything like that. So there's a whole new way of looking at architecture and thinking about it and simplifying it and using more economical thinking. And I think it's going to, I think we're going to see a new generation grow. It just takes a little time, like everything else. But I think the biggest single problem is that the developers of the world are sold on these obscene materials like endless acres of glass and titanium and aluminum and all these terribly anti-environmental materials. And they're in love with them because they can make all these fancy shapes. And I think that's going to change. I think it has to change. I don't know what the alternative is, because they seem to be doing it everywhere. Look at Saudi Arabia wants to build a whole, 20-mile city or something like that. And
I think it's more. It's I think it's over 100 miles. It's enormous. And it's 500 meters tall.
Yeah. That level of insanity is it doesn't show any intelligence whatsoever. It just shows pure ego and greed at work.
I like your quote. You said, architecture is an orchestration of human interaction. Architecture has a responsibility to engage with the public. And you said, how can you change a building to change people's attitude about buildings?
I mean, the best buildings have become sort of the symbol of that now. I think that they did. They introduced the forbidden thing, humor. Now, like I've consulted with graduate students who've done 4 or 5 theses, their whole thesis project on the value of humor in architecture. And I'm one of the main consultants. But I think by adding things like that to the vocabulary, you expand the dialogue, no matter what. You just do. And it seems to have penetrated, and I think architects are trying to do that in various ways now. There is some evidence that the only problem that I find is I get very nervous when it's sort of misunderstood. They don't have an idea first and then create the volumes of shapes to fit the idea. They just imitate. They like the looks of that shape, or they like the looks of that fragmentation, or they like the looks of that tilt, or they like the looks of that whatever. And it's all about the same old thing. It's like the reason I left sculpture is I got tired of shape making for its own sake. So it goes back to that. They take something that was an idea and they convert it back to shape making of some kind.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, they are imitating what was done for a reason. And so your work has a lot to do with the context and process. Who would you credit most for influencing you to go in this direction? And who would you name among those who influenced your work in general?
Well, I would say I'm a visual artist, so probably my my main influences came more from kind of art or poetry or literature or dance, or I'm thinking of things that changed my mind. And Rauschenberg was somebody I admired tremendously. And actually, as you know, we renovated his studio on Lafayette Street when he bought that building. So I didn't get to know him. Sadly, my partner worked with him more than I did. But we had a couple of meetings, and someone with kind of a distance, I was in awe of his invention and the fact that he really did change the idea of painting. That's for sure. It was not just painting on the wall. It kind of wandered off into the room and suddenly became part of real space. And so the illusion reality thing was very powerful. Oh, Marcel Duchamp, I guess everybody in my category loves him because he's the pioneer of conceptual art, and also the idea that art can be about ideas. Yeah, he said himself, I'm really more interested in ideas than physical objects. And I think that always that seems to mean I'm not interested in something you can see, or he said I am non-retinal. But what he meant was he was tired of doing the same old thing. He was tired of doing paintings and imitating cubism, which had already been invented, and he tactile surfaces and colors and all those things. He says there's got to be another way of thinking about art. That's all. This is just. It's, I think, the motivation behind anything that imaginative people do. I mean, it's just, and that's why I when I had my first talk with Artur Drexler, he was very resistant to the whole situation, and we had to talk about Mies van der Rohe. And I remember that time he said to me, "Oh my God, James, you really know a lot about Mies van der Rohe, but how can you like Mies van der Rohe and do what you do?" And I said, "Why should I do what Mies van der Rohe did so well? I want to do what I do." And that's exactly why Bruno Zevi liked what I did. He said, the work you do is obviously not what I'm part of my scholarship, really, but he got really, really interested. And then we had the same kind of discussions that we're having right now about, well, why are you doing what you do? And then you sort of explain it a little, and it makes a lot of sense. So
this is very interesting what you're saying, because I discovered through my interviews, sometimes I would ask architects what kind of work they like. And to my surprise, very often it can be very different from what they actually do. And now, you explained it well. If he already did it, why should I do it even if I like it, right?
That was a great meeting because it was a famous meeting. Emilio Ambasz had been supporting our work as a curator at MoMA, and he kept pushing Artur Drexler to go see us, and he didn't want to do it. He said, "That's not architecture. That's not architecture." So finally, he conceded, "Okay, I'm going to go down." So he calls me on the phone and says, "Well, I'm coming down to see you, but we just have an hour. We have an hour to talk." And so for the hour, we talked about Mies van der Rohe because I knew he was a Miesian scholar and loved the work. And that's when he asked me, "Why do you do your work?" And as soon as I said that, I could see in his face, he suddenly started having respect. So he didn't come for an hour. He came for 3 days in a row. 3 days in a row. And then he bought, some of the best building models and drawings. He started the Highrise of Homes collection. And as you know, at this day, MoMA has the best collection of the best series of any museum. And they also have most of the Highrise of Homes, including the Mylars and my sketches and everything. And the ghost parking lot. They had the original sketch for the ghost parking lot. So obviously, Artur Drexler and Emilio Ambasz combined had a lot of courage and a lot of perception, because what it was the opposite of what they've been supporting traditionally.
This also led to an exhibition at MoMA. Did it happen?
Yeah, it led to an exhibition at MoMA. Well, that's when the AI, just went bananas. They were so insulted that upstarts like SITE would be shown at MoMA.
So was this a solo show? What year?
No, it was it was the best buildings by SITE, and then they had asked other architects, "Well, what would you do with this problem?" They showed it basically what SITE. It was an Artur Drexler show. They showed what SITE does and has done with those buildings. Okay, now what would you do? Because it was a good idea. Because what the point of view was that Artur Drexler realized that everybody was criticizing this or not accepting it or not real architecture, whatever that is. And so he thought it would be very interesting to see what they do. And then some of the reviews I have them still somewhere, afterwards said only SITE did something really interesting. All the rest of them were just decor.
And they invited some architects to.
Yeah, they had Bob Stern and Venturi.
What was the name of the exhibition?
Buildings for Best Products.
Okay. And you also earlier you mentioned Frederick Kiesler as one of the biggest influences.
Kiesler was a real intellect and imaginative person. I met him at the opening at Leo Castelli. There was a group show at Leo Castelli. And I noticed this little guy walks in the room and everybody rushes over him. Rauschenberg rushes over and Jasper Johns, everybody rushes over and starts talking to him. I said, God, who's this little guy? He must be important, you know. So I went over and started talking, and then he said, well, yeah, I'll come and see. I want to see what you do. And because we were talking about architecture and he'd like to talk about it, and I'll come and see what you do. And so he came to the studio, and then we started becoming real friends, and we had dinner once or twice a week together. And, you know, he became a mentor and a promoter and helper. I mean, he really did. I spent time at his summer home, and he had a summer place in the Hamptons. And so, I mean, he really did influence me. But as far as, you know, people into my thought process, that varied a lot. I mean, it depended on, you know, oh God, I'm just trying to think of other people that really had a huge, as I say, it would be mostly visual artists. Obviously Corbusier and Mies I really loved. I really liked their work a lot. And it is primarily not only because they did it so masterfully, but because they were originals, and because, you know, you feel that vision in their work. You know, you feel the vision. You don't feel like it's, well, you know, that one time I thought the highest compliment anyone could ever pay a creative person, there was a tribute being given just before Orson Welles died, a Hollywood tribute. And the master of ceremonies stood up, you know, and they were a lot of speakers, you know, celebrating him. And someone, you know, stood up and said, Orson Welles, he reminds us of no one. And that's the highest compliment you can give it, anyway. Isn't that true?
One of a kind. My last question is whether you would like to clarify anything about the best buildings and its legacy.
Well, you know, at this point, yeah, those buildings and the Highrise of Homes and the Ghost Parking Lot are the three projects. They're very iconic, of course, and so they're the most asked for, and I guess the most discussed. I would like more. I would like somebody to write a really interesting overview that really understands what they're about, and surprises me with some literary insights. Most of the time, there is a sort of OG whiz quality about the writing, like falling bricks or deconstruction, or, you know, all that stuff. And it's really not about that. It really wasn't. It was about other things. And I would like that somebody discuss it and surprise me, really, not tell me something that's been sort of said too many times. I think that would be my desire. But also some sympathy from the architectural profession. You know, I got 3 invitations to the AIA for the first time in my life. I'm 90 years old, and I have all 3 right now. I'm doing one. It's a center in New York, you know, where I've never been invited. I'm doing one for the Monterey thing, and I'm doing one in Florida. And they're AI organizations. So I've done lots of stuff for the student AI, of course, but the official AI has finally recognized I'm here. So and I hardly know what to say because you have to fill in all this stuff we've been talking about. But they always want me to do it in a half an hour. Just tell your life story in a half an hour. So.
Yeah, and on September 15, you will have a chance to talk about quite extensively about your work, and then questions by Barry, right? So it will be a huge chance to really go in detail.
No, it's good. It really is. But I can see, you have to admit it is pretty resistant. I mean, I am a visual artist. I can understand. Well, they say, oh, he's like artists. We don't want artists around, or architects. And he's not registered architect, all this stuff. But we have had an influence on architecture. I mean, realistically, let's face it. And so I think that by now the AI should be relatively sympathetic and say, okay, I think that's what's happening. It's saying, well, okay, he's here. So
I'm done with the questions. So
okay, great, thank you. No, this is a very good question. No, this is interesting because it did give me a chance to talk about that early work in a more expansive way, and also remember some anecdotes and things that I think are helpful. That help inform the whole situation.